I do media for the Singularity Institute. I'm media director, and so I spend a lot of time looking at news stories on transhumanism and what people think about it and stuff like that. And I was really impressed, like doing a scan over for this conference, like what has been covered recently. Like in the last month alone, there have been mentions of the Singularity in Washington Post, New York Times, BBC. Like it's a who's who list of like the top media. So, and it's funny because it's actually getting to the point where people casually mention the Singularity, assuming that the major audience, the mainstream audience, knows what it is. Whereas like before, it's like, oh, it's this new thing, we're going to explain it. Now, like, it's taken for granted that people know what it is. So it's really like prominent and out there. And let's see. So, do we got anything here?
I think you got to plug it in.
Yeah. Does anyone have the new dongle? They changed the dongle on these new laptops.
Is it a PowerPoint presentation if you work on the PC?
Yeah. Let's see.
Sorry.
So anyway, I'll just continue.
Can I yank this?
Yep. Oh, no.
So I made like a graph of the mentions of Singularity in major publications. There's 158 mentions in Popular Science, 126 in New Scientist, 96 in Forbes, 84 in New York Times. So we're getting into like more than 100 mentions of the Singularity or transhumanism like in these major publications, which is something that is completely new, whereas like people were just exploring these ideas 5 years ago. And now like they're being mentioned just about every week. So I think like that now it seems as if the word singularity is like kind of carrying forward as the main like representation of transhumanism because it's received more like PR muscle from folks like Kurzweil. So generally like the term singularity is used. And the coverage is starting to get really good. Like the main achievement, I guess you could say, of transhumanism in the media in the last year was that we had a feature story in the Smithsonian, which is an excellent article. And let's see, there was a quote from Natasha there, which is, "The human quest has always been to ward off death and do everything in our power to keep living." And it lists our organization, Humanity Plus, as having 6,000 members. So, and then just last month, just last month, there was a opinion piece in the New York Times called "How Science Can Build a Better You," which said, "If a brain implant were safe and available and allowed you to operate your iPad or car using only thought, would you want one? What about an embedded device that gently bathed your brain in electrons and boosted memory and attention? Would you order one for your children?" And basically it goes on to say, like, yes, still the enhancements are coming and it would be hard to resist. The real issue is what to do with them once they become irresistible. So now there are opinion writers in the New York Times, which, because sometimes the left is associated with like certain forms of bioconservatism, it's interesting to see a like traditionally liberal publication like the New York Times coming out in favor of something that's sometimes prominently associated with Nazism. It's like when people say eugenics, when people talk about transhumanist ideas, many people immediately think of eugenics, and there's that association with Nazism. So on the left, and especially like with the opposition to genetically modified foods, and the recent like amendment in California to vote on labeling genetically modified foods, it seems like there's a lot of paranoia on the left about advanced technologies. But for like a major mouthpiece of the left, like the Times, to put forward a positive article on transhumanism, I think is a real milestone. So I see like a lot of positive articles. There are a few negative articles, but there's so few on transhumanism, I almost wish there were more so that there would be like a counterpoint for us to argue against, because it's almost too uniformly positive. But there was one somewhat negative article in the New York Post on the less wrong community in New York, and it was one of those situations where there was like a local meetup and a journalist showed up but didn't tell anyone that he was a journalist, so he kind of got like the sneaky route into the community, and you know, it's people just like casually hanging out and stuff, like doing karaoke. But it's a tabloid, the Post, so they kind of poked fun at the less wrong singularity movement, which is, you know, very transhumanist. So here's a quote from one of the transhumanists in the New York less wrong community that they had. It's Zvi Moshevitz. He said, I've made my peace with the fact that, you know, this is not going to last. Mr. Moshowitz said, looking out the window at weekend traffic on 6th Avenue as though it would all disappear. We have a very dysfunctional civilization right now. There are better things that could be done. By the drinks table, his girlfriend sang along with the Lion King's, "I just can't wait to be king." So, like, points fun at the, mundanity of our current lives in contrast with some of, like, these really huge ideas that we have. But, you know, that's all in good fun. I think it's awesome that, you know, we're interesting enough to even write anything funny like that about. So, and then I had to really dig to find, like, anything negative on transhumanism or the Singularity outside of, like, really small, specialized, like, religious conservative blogs. And there was an interesting article on Big Think on November 15th called "The Cult of the Singularity" that attacked Singularity University and Jose Cordero, our good friend. And it's funny because instead of using, like, arguments about there being a leader or a dogma or anything like that, it seemed that the main argument about the Singularity being a cult was that it involves future predictions that might make it so that people try less to solve our problems today, for instance, like global warming. But, so near the end of the article, the author concluded, remember that wacky pastor who predicted the end of the world twice last year? I wouldn't want to bet our global economy on his prophecy or anyone else's. We need to keep doing the small stuff just in case those world-changing innovations don't arrive on time. And I completely agree that we need to care about things that are happening in the near future as well as the far future. But it's like one thing I took away from that article is how, like, lightly the term cult is thrown around. There was no arguments about uniform thinking. It was just an argument that the Singularity makes us take less action in the present. And I think that's a fairly low standard to throw around the term cult. So I think that sometimes when the term cult is thrown around in the transhumanist community from people outside of it criticizing it, I think we might occasionally become too sensitive to that and act as if that we need to deeply modify our behavior in some way because we really are a cult on some level. But I think this article shows that how loosely the term can be thrown around, and sometimes it doesn't need to be taken very seriously. So one of the blogs that does consistently criticize transhumanism, and I keep visiting it again and again because it's an interesting counterpoint, is FutureIMS, which is a blog that is at the New Atlantis. And they reacted negatively to the New York Times article, and they consistently try their best to shoot down transhumanist ideas. So I think they're a valuable source because they're one of the few actual critics. So here's the point that they made. They're talking about a neuroscientist whose name is, his last name is Duncan. They say, Duncan reports that when he asks parents whether they would give their children a memory-boosting drug if everyone else was doing it, most reply yes. But then this other person said, I have asked thousands of people a hypothetical question that goes like this. If I could offer you a pill that allowed your child to increase his or her memory by 25%, would you give it to them? The show of hands in this informal poll has been overwhelming, with 80% or more voting no. So I think that's a little odd. Like, what audiences were these? Like, where can we find them? I'd love to, like, see citations for that kind of thing, because I think that the critics of transhumanism don't actually have enough of a voice, and that maybe even transhumanists should help the critics of transhumanism get their ideas out there, because then we can respond in ways to further develop our ideas and address those points that they see as important. Especially when there's certain parts of the transhumanist community that seem to be unbridledly optimistic, and this tends to be people that were just exposed to Kurzweil like in the last year or two, and some people are just too optimistic and need to start looking at the potential downsides. So the conclusion of the author of that blog post was, that is to say, most people he has asked at least say that they think they would resist the temptation to give their child such a pill, the memory-enhancing pill. If these healthy inclinations can be supported by social consensus buttressed by a variety of good reasons, perhaps enhancement will not be so hard to resist after all. So, you know, there are people that, you know, do resist enhancement and have a real issue with it, and they're trying to step away from it, and I think it's worth paying attention to their arguments. So I divided when I looked at like the 20 articles that had been published on transhumanist topics in the last year, I classified them as the good, the bad, and the confused. So I just went over the good and the bad, And I wish there were more bad, because there's not enough, as I said a million times. But so now I'm moving on to the confused. The biggest article that I think was really confused, the biggest story that was confused, was about a year ago. And it was a story of IBM simulating a cat brain, was the language that went around. And it was even covered by Scientific American. It says, the headline was, IBM simulates 4.5% of human brain and all of the cat brain. So I think this was really irresponsible because it was not true that IBM simulated a cat brain. And let me quote Henry Markram, who's the director of the Blue Brain Project. He said, IBM's claim is a hoax. This is a mega public relations stunt, a clear case of scientific deception of the public. These simulations do not come even close to the complexity of an ant, let alone a cat. IBM allows Moda, that's the director of the project, to mislead the public into believing that they've simulated a brain with the complexity of a cat. Sheer nonsense. Here are the scientific reasons. They claim to have created over 1 billion neurons interacting, but these so-called neurons are the tiniest of points that you can imagine, a microscopic dot. So there's a huge difference between these point neurons in the simulation and real neurons. Over 98% of the volume of a neuron is branches, like a tree. They just cut off all the branches and roots and took a point in the middle of the trunk to represent an entire neuron. In real life, each segment of the branches of a neuron contains dozens of ion channels that powerfully control the information in a processing in a neuron. They have none of that. So this is an instance where a scientist that is very well respected, leads a huge project, deliberately misleads the media by publishing a paper that has like a sensationalist, it was called Letting the Cat Out of the Bag. It was associated with like images of cats, but we don't know the neural wiring diagram of a cat's brain, not even close, not even a tenth of a percent. So the data to create a cat brain doesn't exist. So when people like IBM go forth and tell the media that they've created a cat brain, it sets excessively high expectations. It's a lie, and I'm concerned that transhumanism might have the issue that AI had in the 50s and 60s, where it overpromised and completely destroyed the reputation of the field. So, and also this shows like that we can't trust scientists to necessarily be scientific. They are human beings like all of us, and they have PR interests, and they will exaggerate their accomplishments if there aren't third parties to put them in check. So I think that just because someone's a scientist doesn't necessarily mean that their quotes or their message is scientific. And then another item I put down in the confused column was extremely liberal use of the word singularity. It's been tossed around everywhere. Forbes recently had a headline, "Teaching the iPhone to Drive, the Coming Singularity in Machine Vision." And it begins by saying, this is a story of the coming singularity, and it talks about the singularity, and then suddenly segues into machine vision and how it's improving. And it's tempting for a lot of people to overuse this term because it's trendy, it's been thrown around. So it's really important to like keep an eye on that, because if you keep using a term too often, it becomes meaningless. Okay, so let's see, I have a third example of confusion, which is MSNBC had an article really recently saying scientists say they're close to unlocking the secrets of immortality. There's nothing that would stop people from living for thousands of years. Scientists are making strides that indicate they'll be able to regrow tissue, organs, and limbs, which could add hundreds of years to the human lifespan. Now, it's pretty standard to like beef up headlines in a major publication, but this is ridiculous. Scientists are not close to unlocking the secrets of immortality. And unscientific headlines like this, make people get irrationally exuberant, and I think it can be damaging. So yeah, that's my overview. I just picked like 2 or 3 articles in each category, and I gave you the overview of what's up with that. So that's all.
It's interesting, one of the themes that Jermaia's had before was actually getting something visceral to give to people they can connect with in terms of like an article or science communication. But, at the same time, we need to be a bit careful that we're not actually sending out the wrong ideas or confused ideas. How do you temper the difference between these two ideals of like getting people interested, getting them viscerally involved, and actually being I wouldn't say intellectually honest, but like trying to be accurate with your writing, with your science writing?
I think like by being precise and actually caring about not exaggerating, you can be scientific and also interesting. But it's a huge challenge because like anyone that is a writer that's tried to get their ideas out there knows like you have to pick sensationalistic titles to get attention. So like recently we even criticized George Dvorsky because he wrote a headline that made it seem as if that scientists were developing a actual robot bee or a simulation of a bee, whereas like actually uploading a bee, where in reality all they were doing is trying to take certain behavioral features of bees and create a program that slightly approximates it. So it's not the same thing. So my point is just that like even people that are trying their best still have a lot of trouble with this issue, and that you just have to put realism over sensationalism and realize like that when you put something on the internet, it's there forever, so people can criticize you about it if it's stupid.
Have you considered trying to get The Onion to write an article on the Singularity?
I think they already have written several articles on it.
Ah, never seen them.
I think that
they just did a bunch for TED Talks. The Onion takes TED Talks.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Singularity was how the North Korean leader actually became sexist.
Yeah, he's the cool guy now, ain't he? All right. Yeah.
Computer reactions and less reactions to GM foods. I think that it's important that we understand what that reaction is. When I did my thesis on public discourses surrounding genetic modification, and particularly canola. And a lot of the time when you actually talk to people, they're not anti the science, they're anti groups like Monsanto. So when you can talk to them about being pro-science and in a way that separates those things out, this discussion becomes so much easier and you end up being on the same side of it. So I think it's important to technology applications through big business that often really scares people.
Yeah, I agree, but there's also like I looked at a SF like responsible voters guide, and on the vote about the GMO, it said like the end conclusion was like we want fresh food, not something that was made in a lab.
That's because big labs like Monsanto really scare people, and the idea that you can't access that
Yeah, I think like that the left is like coming around to this because of discussions like that.
I think this is a great point because I think there has to be a clear distinction. Biotechnology is great, gene therapy is great, all that stuff is great, but without the hindsight of Monsanto, and that's what scares people up and creates this reaction that's far left. It's a kind of compensation.
Yeah.
And because I see two categories when you talk about, for example, gene therapy. If you have sickle cell anemia and I cure you with gene therapy, that's great. Everybody's well off. The health system is better off. But if I give you a greater, let's say, intelligence enhancement, then I offer you a competitive advantage. So I'm worse off and you're better off. So that's where the ethical problems come in, when there are differences.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's always going to be differences like that. Yeah, it's difficult. And also, like, a lot of new technologies need to be developed by, like, extremely large corporations since there's a huge capital investment, so it's really hard to, like, separate those two. I think we only have, like, 30 more seconds, but I believe you had your hand up.
I would like to mention that one of the biggest problems that seems to keep coming up is people keep mentioning improvement. There are people who literally deliberately want to create problems, actual handicaps, and their intent with genetic line or germline repair is not so much for repair as it is to deliberately hurt.
Well, what's an example?
They're in one case where they described how they would like to actually the broken window theory cause poorer eyesight for the sake of generating revenue. It's not something you would see normally, but it's starting to show up.
Andrea, you ready to go up?
Yep.
All right.
Let's just